Welcome back to the Wealth Actually podcast. I'm Fraser Rice. I'm joined today by Dr. Daniel Crosby. He's a multiple-time author, and his new book, The Soul of Wealth, has come out recently. He's a Ph.D. psychologist, and he is heavily involved in the wealth management industry. We're going to talk a little bit about what he does, and we're going to talk a little bit about his new book, which is terrific, and we will take it from there. Welcome aboard, Dan.
Thank you. Great to be here.
So tell us a little bit about the day job in addition to being an author. You are a behavioral officer at Orion. What does that involve?
Yeah, chief behavioral officer. Not many like me. So there's really a couple of hats that I wear. One is I do a lot of public-facing work for the company. I do a lot of podcasts, a lot of traveling to give sort of big presentations at conferences, and a lot of public speaking on behalf of Orion. Second big piece of what I do is around advisor education. So we have what's called the Orion Advisor Academy. It's free continuing ed for advisors, largely around how to integrate practical behavioral finance into a business. And then finally, it's technology. You know, we are a fintech company first and foremost, and we are trying to behavioralize every part of the technology stack and every part of our financial planning operation. So we have a risk tolerance questionnaire that measures, in addition to things like tolerance and capacity, measures someone's emotional stability. I developed a 20-question assessment of financial values and personality that you can take with your spouse or a loved one, and it will compare and contrast you across 5 different dimensions. Came up with a goals-based investing platform that's rooted in psychology. So we are trying to infuse every part of the planning and the wealth management process with behavioral finance in a way that's sort of seamless and behind the scenes. So it's not this like open up and take your medicine kind of situation.
So with wealth management really trying to morph in many ways or evolve from purely a math-based scenario to one that involves psychology and understanding biases and behaviors and so on, it would take us through what drove the book Soul of Wealth. And for our listeners, it's 50 very interesting essays about, what wealth means, maybe some different ways to think about it and different ways to feel about wealth. What drove the writing of the book for you?
Yeah, really, it boils down to this Viktor Frankl quote I have that I've loved for many years that, ever more people have the means to live, but no meaning to live for. We are the richest society that has ever existed. It has never been easier for the human family to get by. When this great country was founded, 85% of the world was living in poverty. Today, that number is 9%. We are living on $2 or less a day. So the middle class is growing, wealth is growing. We've never been more comfortable. Those bottom 2 rungs of Maslow's hierarchy have never been better met. And yet we see unprecedented levels of loneliness, depression, suicide, anxiety. And there is a big disconnect. Like, we're very comfortable, but we're not very happy. And so the book was trying to bridge that gap really in sort of a big way. And then when you look at our industry, you've got people like McKinsey and their Wealth Management 2030 white paper saying the future of wealth management is effectively, I hate this word, but, life coaches who know how to help you with your money. And AI is going to hasten that. AI is going to do the technical and the analytical parts of our jobs better than we ever could. And I think that's good news because it's going to leave us to do what we do best, which is behavioral coaching, connection, and sort of life design.
When you get into the life design component, in many ways, one of the things I think about when I hear studies like that is that the one-to-one relationship and building the skill level around the math to include the behavioral coaching and some of the softer sides of things. The thing that I find that gets lost a lot is the component of understanding group dynamics, either in a board setting from helping someone advise on a business to interspousal, interfamily, intrafamily, and other relationships. How do you think about that when you're coaching advisors to work with clients and families?
I think a lot of people who study psychology think that groups are just lots of individuals, and that's not true, right? I mean, there are specific dynamics that come into play. I mean, we could spend many hours talking about this, but when we think about groups writ large, one thing that we see is group polarization. That when groups get together, we used to think that they would sort of cancel each other out and moderate each other's opinions, while they actually exacerbate and deepen and make more radical each other's opinions. So whatever sort of dysfunction exists at the micro level in a family gets magnified at the macro level. And I think family wealth advisors and people who are dealing with family offices and other things have to be aware of those dynamics. I've done some research too into spousal dynamics. We interviewed 425 couples and effectively talked to them about what they fight about when they fight about money. And the number one thing we found, the number one answer we found, was that there were differences on whether money is best used to enjoy today or to secure an uncertain tomorrow. And when you hear those two ends of that continuum, they're both important. Like both of them are critical, and an integration of those ideas is critical to a life well lived. And yet people tend to grow up in family systems where one or the other idea is supported and given sort of shine to the detriment of the other. And people tend to get very entrenched in their values around those things. So an awareness of family dynamics, group dynamics is absolutely critical. And for a lot of people, the way you grow up thinking about money is your homeostasis, right? That's your normal. And it's only when you get in relation with another person, when you move in with someone, you get married, that these clashing dynamics come into play. So for a lot of people, that is their first experience of like, hey, the way that I grew up with money isn't the only way. And I think that is a largely untapped but deeply important part of our world.
How do you think about the concept of people changing during the course of their lives on a continuum basis? I mean, you talk about sort of the homeostasis of how you grew up experiencing and then thinking about wealth. And for someone who, maybe grew up with meager beginnings and becoming wealthy and changing as a result, and then having that change manifested on a spouse or the rest of the family, you get into a lot of different dimensions at that point. How do you advise them to get their arms around that so that they're not only advising around the wealth, but they're giving people the perspective to think about their own dynamic?
So people do change, right? Like we know that people change. Certain characteristics in a person change more than others. Like if we look at even, like the most common personality traits, some of them change more. Preferences around planfulness and conscientiousness and preparedness tend to change quite a bit. But then dynamics around extroversion or introversion don't change much. So it really is sort of, piece by piece, thing by thing about how prone we are to change. The other thing we know is even when someone is changing or trying to make a change, that stress tends to bring us back to our comfort level or the way that we grew up. And when we look at money, it's a deeply stress-inducing thing. This year's APA top stressors in America has money as the number one stressor in the country. Number two stressor is work. Number three stressor is the economy. So it's like money, and money, effectively. So money and its sort of tentacles are the top three stressors in our lives. And so even if we're trying to make a change, it becomes very easy for us to go back to the person that we've always been or the way that we grew up. So change is possible, but change is hard, and change gets harder when we're under stress.
How do you think about the concept of disappointment when people think that either money is going to fix things or that they have gotten to a certain level of success and there is an emptiness there and the resulting impact in the people around them? Did any of your studies sort of get into that at all?
So it's interesting. I just recorded an episode of my podcast right before doing this, and the gentleman in question had exited a number of businesses and made a bunch of money. And, I talked to him about how he felt after that. And he said, disappointed. And then he went on to write a book about how to build and sell a business. And he talked to hundreds of other business owners. And their sort of prevailing emotion was sort of disillusionment, disappointment. I have a mentor of mine who sold his business for hundreds of millions of dollars, but then felt like he lost his sense of self and actually had cards made up that had his name on it. And as his title, he put former person. Because he felt that he had like been stripped of selfhood. Everything, his identity was so wrapped up in his work and his success. So, I mean, at various points in the book, we talk about this and this idea of what is true wealth and where are we building our house? Is it a castle on a foundation of sand, or are we building on something a little more permanent than that? One of the ideas that I think helps get to answer this question more directly is a model developed by Martin Seligman that I introduced in the first chapter called the PERMA model. And it talks about basically the 5 facets of a joyful life. And it's positive experiences, which is, having fun; engagement, which is deep work; relationships is the third piece, being loved, giving love. The fourth piece is meaning, working for something bigger than ourselves, be that, religion, spirituality, philanthropy, charitable giving, teamwork. And then the last piece is advancement or achievement, growing, self-actualization, self-betterment. So I think that is a good place to start. And I think when we have great financial success and we feel this sense of disappointment, we've over-indexed on maybe one of those 5 pillars, right? We've thought about all the fun that money can buy us, but maybe we haven't given adequate thought to keeping our relationships robust or working for a higher purpose or self-growth. Because I think those are the things that tend to provide more enduring, more satisfying self-actualization.
How do you think about, from a time perspective area, the concept of horizon shifting? When people are focused on themselves and their families, and then making sure that things like college educations are funded, and then retirements are funded and planned for otherwise, and then you start shifting to legacy beyond your lifetime. Did you do any work on that and sort of understanding how that contributes, A, to happiness, and then B, sort of the advice that goes into helping people achieve that?
I don't really know anything about it. I'll be honest. I don't really know anything about it. I don't have really much to say about that.
I guess where I'm coming from on it is that when people start to, sort of put, and maybe this is part of the advancement component of your pillar, maybe the legacy that they create ultimately, is that something that drives a lot of psychological engagement?
I think it is. I mean, people are sort of wired to endure. And I think one of the, at the risk of getting kind of deep and kind of philosophical here, I think almost any philosophy, almost any school of psychology is going to deal pretty directly with death anxiety and people's desire to matter and live on beyond their finite time here. And so I think that legacy planning is one of the most powerful things that we can do, because that is a very natural human tendency for sure.
When putting the book together, you've obviously got your research as, sort of from the Ph.D. psychological world, et cetera. What did you get from when you talked to different advisors or even at the client level that helped to inform some of the things that you wrote about?
I'm lucky that I get to engage with advisors every day, and their clients probably every 2 weeks. Most of my work is advisor facing, but I do a decent bit of client work as well. So, the 50 essays in the book were absolutely informed by, not only the research, but also the boots on the ground sort of perspective of advisors. And there is a groundswell of support for this, what I'm hearing called human first advice, sort of more and more these days. I've been doing this for about 15 years, and I have never seen the enthusiasm for it that I've seen now. And I think a lot of it goes back to those macro considerations that we talked about. Like we've been in, I mean, look, there have been bad spots, but for more often than not, for the past 15 years, the market's been up and to the right. And even though we're dealing with problems like inflation and other things that hit people's pocketbooks, the economy is good, life is good. And I think yet we have at the same time, in the past couple of years, we've, for the first time in US history, had a declining average age at death because of people not taking care of their bodies, people harming themselves, and people abusing substances. So we have these deaths of despair at a same time when there is so much abundance. And there's a huge disconnect, and clients are hurting, even some of the wealthiest clients around. So those stories were a big reason why I wrote the book in the first place, and certainly helped to inform how I chose the chapters.
As we look into the future a little bit about where an advisor's expertise starts and stops, how do you think about that continuum between, say, therapist and financial advisor? And are there places where the skills and the magic for the psychologist and the therapist, it's not appropriate for the financial advisor to wade into those waters?
For sure. I think there is a place, when you think about visits to a GP, 1/4 of visits to a general practitioner doctor end in a referral to a mental health professional. And that is because so much of what passes for bodily symptoms have some sort of psychological root. I anticipate a day, it may not be 25%, but I anticipate a day where a higher and higher number of people who come to see an advisor for something that is ostensibly a financial problem, if not a total referral, will also see a concurrent referral to a mental health professional for something that is just sort of out of scope for an advisor. At the same time, so much of what heals, if you look at the outcomes literature on psychotherapy, there's this crazy study that always makes me regret getting a Ph.D., but they looked at, outcomes for people who went to see a mental health professional. And there was no difference in outcomes between bachelor's, master's, and Ph.D. And school of thought was irrelevant as well. Like it didn't matter if they were, Freudian or CBT or whatever. The thing that mattered the most was whether there was rapport between that therapist and that client. It's not like there was a magic bag of tricks. It's not like they said these magic words. It was literally that they just had a safe space with someone they liked to come explore these things. So I think as advisors start to get the fundaments of just human interaction right at a higher level, when we get some of the basics there, I think a lot of it takes care of itself. I don't think there are certainly cases where a referral is warranted, but I think there's many more cases where what is ailing a client will be fixed by just having a safe place to talk to an advisor about some life consideration or a financial consideration.
Along that line, and maybe this is sort of a weird concept for me to think about, but certainly at the upper end where, let's say resources are less of an issue, does it make sense in a married situation for each spouse to have their own advisor, especially if rapport is important?
So, that I would just say that your mileage will vary there. There are certainly people who keep their finances separate. I think this is one of those issues where there's such hot takes and there's such a spirited debate on this. There are people who see not combining finances as like a form of infidelity. There are people who see combining finances as a form of coercion. And so I think your mileage and your relationship may vary, I think that is totally going to be an N of one, N of two consideration. I can certainly see cases where that's appropriate. And I think in other relationships, it would feel inappropriate. And I don't think there's a right answer there. I think it's just whatever you navigate with your partner and whatever feels right for you.
Along that line, and maybe in a different way, how do you see the financial advisor as maybe either a mediator or having to deal with conflict within a family unit that may be sort of along the same lines of the question of, where does the scope start and stop? But as people start to expect the human element to encompass more and more things, how much of that do you think falls back onto the financial advisor? Maybe not now, but in the future.
One of the things about mental health, and indeed financial mental health, is that it's a continuum, right? There's no bright line where, what an advisor can do, starts and what a therapist should do starts and stops. So the thing that I would say, sort of the defining, when you look at like the DSM, the Bible of psychiatric illness, we've all dieted, right? We've all dieted, but a diet becomes problematic and it becomes an eating disorder when it starts to interfere with the tasks of daily living. We've all been sad, but it becomes major depressive disorder when it starts to interfere with the tasks of daily living. So I think likewise, every family has financial turmoil. Every family has disagreements about money. At the point that those become so loud or so angry that it's starting to interfere with sort of that machine running smoothly, I think that's as close as I could get to a line of demarcation for when you bring in a professional. At a low level, some low level disagreement, I think an advisor can handle that fine. And I actually have, I think, more faith in advisors to handle that than they do in themselves. This is one of the most common questions I get from advisors is, what happens when things start getting messy? And I say, like, look, money is messy. Relationships are messy. I wouldn't be scared of a little mess. But when the mess gets so big that it gets loud or it gets angry or there's sort of an immobilization or an inability to talk, then I think maybe you bring in a pro.
A pet theory of mine is that the term research misconduct is going to become a bigger and bigger part of the lexicon of daily discourse. I think people's faith and trust in institutions has been challenged, maybe even shaken over the last 12 to 20 years. And as that bleeds into the wealth management industry or life insurance or anything where people have on faith that there are studies and math that underpins the recommendations that they're getting, do you see an area there to be wary of? I worry that that trust is assumed in the wealth management industry where it may not necessarily be the case, and that the let's call it the dark arts of psychology could be dangerous on that front. Is that something that you advise advisors on, as far as making sure that not only that the rapport is there, but the data goes along with it?
If you think about something like the replication crisis that's happening in the behavioral sciences, I don't see any reason why you wouldn't expect something similar in a lot of financial research that is indeed driven by human actors, right? This is what we know about psychological research is it's very fickle. It's small environmental changes can dramatically impact results, and sort of you never walk through the same river twice because human behavior and environmental considerations are always changing. The same thing is true of markets. I just think we as an industry have to be appropriately tentative about our recommendations, but pounding the table about the things that we can pound the table about. I think sometimes these products and quote unquote evidence-based investing gets pitched to clients with a level of certainty that exceeds right? The level of certainty we can have about something that is so human. So I just think we need to be appropriately tentative about our recommendations. But, I think a lot of the fundaments of good financial behavior aren't going anywhere. Things like diversification, some level of relationship between risk and reward, even though it doesn't seem like it matters much these days, some level of, impact of valuation on future returns. I think we can talk about these things as broad generalities and things to keep in mind. I think my problem is when people take a number as gospel. You see this with things like the 4% rule or, markets giving you 10% a year. I see this most commonly among folks in the FIRE movement. They'll go, well, the stock market will give me 10 to 11% a year, so then I will have X. Well, sometimes the market gives you 10% a year. Sometimes it gives you 50%. Sometimes it gives you negative 50%. And sometimes you invest for a decade and you make no money. And I just think you need to be a little more tentative and a little bit more historically informed before selling clients something at a level that outstrips the level of certainty we can have.
From your lips to God's ears, I completely agree that the level of certainty in the industry sometimes is, to me, with my legal background, and I sit there going, there are floods seem to happen every 10 years in 100-year floodplains, and to sort of go on something more certain than that can be fraught with peril. As you were writing the book, were there any particularly surprising things? You come at it from a deep well of experience and multiple books. And was there anything that when you were going through and putting pen to paper that you had your mind changed from what was your conventional wisdom beforehand?
The thing that came up a couple of times was, what I'll call that happiness in one study, contentment in another study, was almost always one part, we'll call it practical, and one part spiritual, if you will. So if you look at financial contentment, the two best predictors, and they're equally predictive, are how much money do you have? Okay, makes sense. And how much money do you give away? Those were the neck and neck, the top two predictors. It's how much money do you have and how generous are you? And so what you find is that if you look at a bell curve of just, dollar, wealth distribution, you've got people in the 20th, 15th percentile who feel wealthy because they're charitable. And you've got people in the 99th percentile for wealth who feel poor because they're stingy. And so it's just again and again in the book, I saw that, there are practical realities to money, right? It's not all mindset. Money matters. Money solves real problems. I love it. You love it. It does good things. It has the potential to do real good. But in and of itself, it's not all money. It's not all mindset. It's combining actual abundance with sort of psychological abundance that's enough. So you see that with charitable giving. You also see that with reference classes. Another study talked about, how happy are people? And the two best predictors were, again, how much money do you have, the practical consideration, and who are you comparing yourself to? Are you comparing yourself to Elon Musk, or are you comparing yourself in perhaps a more fruitful way? So that was cool to me, that abundance is, 50% practical, 50% spiritual, psychological, existential.
Great stuff. Dr. Daniel Crosby, thank you for being on The Soul of Wealth. His new book is out. Dan, how do we find you? How do we find the book?
Yeah, go grab The Soul of Wealth. I'd love for you to check it out. I have a podcast, Standard Deviations. I am on LinkedIn, Daniel Crosby, Ph.D., and on Twitter at Daniel Crosby.
Links will be in the show notes. And thanks again for being on.
My pleasure. Thanks, Fraser.